Okay, Alexander, are you ready to roll? We're live, I
Yes,
think.
yes, yes,
I think we
yes,
are live. We should be live.
yes.
Let's get the chat open and see who's joining us. What's the topic for today, Alexander? I wonder what we will be talking about.
Well, there's one enormous story, a very portentous story, which is these attacks on these tankers in the Gulf. We don't know who's responsible, but they seem to be very sophisticated attacks indeed. All this happening at a time of extreme international tension, and one has to be extremely worried about the reaction. And at the moment, it's been striking that the people who are talking about it most are the Iranians, who must be especially worried that this is a provocation directed against themselves. I say that because I find it very difficult to believe that
Yeah.
Iran is behind these attacks.
All right. So if you guys can hear me and Alexander, let me know in the chat. People are jumping on, and hit that like button, guys, because that like
Mm,
button makes sure that the
yeah.
video gets sent out along Google's mysterious algorithms. The
Mm,
algorithms that tend to suppress many of our video views,
yes.
notifications, and other stuff. So, if the broadcast is good, let me know. Good evening to everyone that is joining us for a live chat. This will be a quick one, around 30 minutes at most. We just want to get everyone up to speed on the
Yes.
breaking news on the all tanker submarine is what it was, maybe, Alexander,
Well,
a missile attack. I
yeah.
mean, no one really
Yes.
knows, but
No.
this
It,
wasn't. This seems to
yeah.
me that this was a pretty organized kind of
Yes.
thing. I mean,
Yes.
this wasn't
I,
no accident, that's for sure.
well, indeed.
And of course,
Indeed.
everyone is saying, is this the Gulf of Tonkin moment in the Strait of Hormuz? I don't think we're there yet, and God
No.
hope we don't ever get there. But no doubt this was a pretty serious provocation, and I think you mentioned it, Alexander. The question is, who? The Saudis were very quick to get a statement out, very quick, and
Mm,
of course this takes place at a time. One of the tankers was a Japanese tanker, and sure enough, the Japanese prime minister was in Iran
mm,
meeting with Iranian officials. So that alone is very, very suspicious. And even Bloomberg, to my
mm,
surprise, even Bloomberg said that an attack like
mm.
this does not benefit Iran whatsoever, especially with the timing of the Japanese prime minister in Iran and all that's going on. So Thomas says the sound is excellent. We have hello
Mhm.
from Cyprus. We have hello from Virginia. Yes, it is hot news. Hello, Nigel. How you doing? Loud and clear says not today. G20 Osaka end of the month. Yes, Cardiff. Serbia. Hello, Voy IP001. Black. Let's see. Dragon Energy. Hello. Scott McCausland. Hello. Yanis. Hello from Greece. Hello from Kent. Hello from Madrid. AppX, how you doing? All right, Alexander. So I said a lot during the opening intro. What do you make of
Mm.
what happened in this breaking news story?
Well, first of all, this is, as you correctly say, a very sophisticated attack by the look of it. I mean, the talk is that torpedoes were launched against these ships. There was even talk earlier in the day that one of the tankers actually sank, though that's now been denied, apparently. Now, torpedoes um, is something one rather associates with submarines. I mean, the days when you used to get high speed boats like we used like the ones which the North Vietnamese were supposed to have used in the Gulf of Tonkin with surface launching of torpedoes. That's really all past now because small fast ships tend to use missiles now more than torpedoes. But of course, submarines still use torpedoes. And one would assume that a torpedo attack, if that is what it was probably carried out by a submarine. However, if it was a submarine attack, then that clearly points to a state actor. And I have to say that it's very difficult for me to believe that that state actor was Iran at a time when, as you correctly say, the Iranians were in talks with the Japanese Prime Minister, when Iran is very anxious to maintain its oil exports to various countries, including Japan, which used to be a major buyer of Iranian oil, but which is now gradually succumbing to the sanctions pressure. And at a time when the Iranians, as far as I can see, have no interest in provoking a military conflict in the Gulf at all. I know there are some people who will say that the Iranians are giving a warning here by launching these attacks, that they're in a position to choke off the Gulf of Hormuz and the oil tanker trade by launching attacks of this kind. I can't really see them needing to make such a warning at this time and doing it in this very reckless and very provocative way. And I am not going to try and guess who else could have done this, but I will make one point, that one individual in this world, in this part of the world, has shown a consistent propensity for violent and reckless behavior, and is also well known for being a strong supporter of military action against Iran. And that person is, of course, Mohammed bin Salman,
MBS.
who is the
MBS,
crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Exactly.
And he's a hothead.
And he's a hothead. And as you rightly said earlier on this program, when we started this program, a lot of the initial commentary about all of this and a lot of the initial accusations actually came pouring out of Saudi Arabia, which does make you wonder, whether that's just a chance. Now, I want to stress here, this is more guesswork on my part. Myself putting the dot, joining up the dots. I'm not definitely saying it was the Saudis who did this thing, but it doesn't make sense to me that it was the Iranians. I can't see what they would gain from this. And as I said, Mohammed bin Salman does have a history of making sudden, volatile, unpredictable, and dangerous decisions. We saw that with the Khashoggi affair. We've seen that with the war in Yemen. We've seen that with the hijacking of the Prime Minister of Lebanon. And, maybe we're looking at it again.
All right, and I'm looking at a headline right now, Alexander, from Zero Hedge. It's the lead story on Zero Hedge. It says, Saudis suggest Iran-backed Houthi rebels responsible for tanker attack. And they are making the claim that they can connect this attack to a similar attack by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebels that happened last year in the Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia has now officially tried to pin this on Houthi rebels, which are backed by Iran, and that's going to be the narrative going forward. What do you make of that headline via Zero Hedge?
I think you've put your finger on it. I mean, it's going to be the narrative going forward. There's the Houthis acting, no doubt, here as proxies of Iran. The Saudis and the Trump hardliners, the Trump administration hardliners, Bolton and Pompeo, have been projecting the Houthis as proxies of Iran. Not true, by the way. There's no evidence that the Houthis are simply proxies of Iran. There is a sympathy and a connection between the Houthis and Iran, but there's very little evidence that the Iranians are actually arming the Houthis in any significant way. And undoubtedly, the Houthis are capable of fighting a war by themselves, and all the indications are that that is what they've been doing. Now, I have to say, I doubt that this attack was carried out by the Houthis for two reasons. Firstly, if it was the Houthis, I would have expected them to say so. I mean, they've been quite open about claiming credit for attacks on Saudi Arabian installations when they've launched missile attacks on them from Yemen. So I don't see why the Houthis would hold back on a claim that they've done something like this if they had in fact done it, and they've made no such claim up to now. But more importantly, I don't see how they have this capability. Yemen and the Houthis are entirely blockaded within Yemen itself. They don't have submarines if these were torpedoes and if they were launched by submarines. And I don't really see how they could have this capability to do this thing, assuming that the descriptions of it are true.
Here's a comment from Saya on the chat, Alex, and it's an interesting one. It says, Alex, let's get to the heart of the matter. All this BS with the sabotage and drama is not going anywhere. There is no evidence the U.S. will attack Iran, and Saudi Arabia and Israel certainly won't. What's the point? Now, you mentioned torpedoes, and for now, people are saying that these were torpedoes, most likely from a submarine. Obviously, to me, that would say Israel, that would say CIA, US, that would say UK. What do you make of that statement from Saya in the chat, and what do you make of what I just said as well, Alexander?
Well, first of all, let's unpack this. I mean, who does have submarines? I mean, Israel certainly has submarines. The US has nuclear submarines. Would they be operating them in this way? I doubt it, actually. Other countries hostile to Iran also have submarines, but Israel has to be a distinct possibility. And let's be very clear about this. The Israelis do have a record of engaging in provocations. Now, will there be a war between the United States and Iran? Now, I've heard what our viewers said, and logically and rationally, he is right. I mean, there must be many people in the Pentagon who must be horrified at the idea of the United States getting drawn into a war with Iran. Iran is a big, very big country. It's mountainous. It's shown an ability to fight back and resist. It's got much better armed forces than Iraq did when Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq. And I've no doubt at all that the Iranians would resist, and that would create a huge crisis in the Gulf. The problem is, when one is dealing with people like Pompeo and Bolton and Netanyahu in Israel, who's coming under very severe political pressure there, where his attempt to form a government has failed, and where he's facing new elections, and where there's now criminal proceedings being brought against him. And when I was also looking at people like Mohammed bin Salman, I think to say that there is no real danger of a war with Iran is complacent. I can very easily see how people could be talked into a war with Iran, even against their better judgment, because these people that I've just mentioned, they now have so much investment in facing down Iran that if there is a major military clash, it may be difficult for them simply to turn away from it. And when I say a clash with Iran, I think initially you would not see an all-out attack on Iran, but you could see, say, US and Israeli airstrikes of the sort that happen in Syria all the time, perhaps of a limited nature and duration initially, but with the risk that they could gradually be ramped up over time. So I'm afraid I don't discount this possibility at all.
An attack of this type, Alexander, this, a torpedo or a missile or whatever it was, you would make the assumption that the United States, Russia, UK, China, many big powers, many great powers know what happened, correct?
Absolutely, and I'm sure that intelligence agencies around the world are working round the clock to try and find out. Now, can I just say something? If it was a submarine, that already limits very considerably the list of potential suspects. Not everybody has submarines and is capable of carrying out the sort of operation. So it would be that would immediately be a clue as to who did it. And contrary to what many people think, it's actually possible to track submarines fairly effectively nowadays. I mean, they may be, relatively invisible when they're underwater, but they have to go to ports, they have to surface if they're diesel-electric submarines from time to time, or at least put up snorkels to take in air, and eventually the intelligence services around the world of the major powers, of the great powers, will have figured out who it was.
Well, won't there also be forensic evidence as well, Alexander, after the fact?
Absolutely.
I mean, they'll
Absolutely.
be able to look at the damage done
Indeed,
and be able to say,
Debbie,
okay, this weapon is an Iranian weapon, this weapon is an Israeli weapon, this is a U.S. I mean,
correct. That's absolutely the case. I mean, they can carry out examination of the debris. I mean, I remember them doing this some years ago when a North Korean submarine was alleged to have sunk a South Korean vessel, and they carried out examinations of the torpedo, the wreckage of the torpedo that had been used in that attack, and it was claimed, though disputed by the North Koreans, that it was a North Korean manufacture, and that proved that it was a North Korean attack. But they can certainly do the same. I mean, they can tell with very, very high, almost certain, very high levels of probability and almost certainty who made a particular torpedo, and that is in itself a clue as to who was operating it.
can you make the assumption that this provocation, the one that happened a couple weeks ago, this is all kind of a slow walking to some sort of conflict with Iran? In other words, one provocation here, another one. This one's a little more severe than the one that happened previously a couple of weeks ago. Once again, with oil
Yes.
tankers. The next one that's going to happen, say in another 2-3 weeks time, will be a little more severe. And eventually you're just
Yes.
going to kind of, it's almost like building a case against someone where eventually
Well,
you'll
that's
have
exact-
Bolton or Pompeo say, okay, enough's enough. These guys, these Iranians are, they've done this too much. We have to do something now.
That's exactly what's happening. That's exactly what we're seeing. This is a list of provocations, and I expect within a few hours the United States to formally say that it was the Iranians who were in some way involved, and to threaten the Iranians with action if they persist in doing this. And I also predict that that the next time this happens, if there's that kind of warning from the United States, by the way, it's a certainty that there will be such an action, because that will encourage Iran's various enemies to stage more provocations precisely in order to engineer an attack on Iran. I should say, in the case of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, I mean, I read an interview he gave in which he was quite openly calling for war with Iran. And I think that is what he basically wants. So, I mean, there's one person who I think actually wants it.
How about Trump going into 2020? Is this something
No,
he wants?
No, I think he doesn't want it.
Bolton
at
and
all.
Pompeo, there's no doubt about it. They want it.
I
But,
don't think
Trump is also, with every day that goes by, Alexander, it's getting closer to 2020. I mean, the window
Exactly.
for where Trump is going to actually pull the trigger on some sort of conflict with anybody, especially Iran,
Yes.
that window is closing fairly quickly.
Correct. I don't think Donald Trump wants a war with Iran at all. I mean, I don't think he likes Iran. In fact, I think on the contrary, he dislikes Iran intensely. And I think he is the most pro-Israeli president we've had. And that's saying something. But I certainly don't think he wants another war with Iran, which threatens to increase oil prices, put pressure on his electoral base, and involve the United States in another conflict, when he made a clear commitment as a presidential candidate in 2016 that he would reduce America's involvement in overseas conflicts, not increase it. But the problem with this is how much control does Donald Trump have over the situation now? If people like Bolton, Pompeo, and Gina Haspel, the CIA director, come along to Donald Trump and say to him, the Iranians are carrying out these attacks and we need to react, because if we don't, we will be putting our allies, Saudi Arabia and Israel, in jeopardy, and the oil trade could be in jeopardy also. What does Donald Trump say in that situation, given the extent to which he has already committed the United States to a confrontation with Iran? It would require a very strong-minded president, I think, to face down the hardliners and to say no. And with Donald Trump, unfortunately, one can't be sure.
How will the EU react, Alexander? How will the UK react? What do they want?
Well, I think
because the EU is, for the most part, they're tied into Iran with the nuclear agreement. They have not backed out of it, at least as of today, even though it is on shaky ground.
Well, I think the Europeans are reaping the consequences of their own weakness and their inability to make themselves felt as a serious force. Now, I think that they would be horrified by another war in the Gulf between the United States and its allies and Iran. The whole project that the European Union was following, the reason why they lobbied so hard for the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran, was because they wanted to re-establish relations with Iran so that they could import oil and gas from Iran. And they did that, in part, by the way, so as to reduce their dependence on oil and gas from Russia. But I think that they now find that they are involved in something that they cannot control because they were so weak in standing up for the JCPOA with the United States. Instead of saying to the United States, we're going to stand with Iran, we're going to back the JCPOA. If you sanction our companies for trading with Iran, we will sanction yours, and taking strong action in that way. They did nothing, and now they're paying the price for it.
And what about the UK?
All right, the UK is in a slightly different position because it's very divided. The opposition Labour Party is led by Jeremy Corbyn. He would be completely opposed to a war with Iran. The Conservative Party, which is the governing party, is divided. But I think the dominant force within the Conservative Party, including the most likely person to become the next British Prime Minister, who is Boris Johnson, would instinctively back the United States and Israel on a conflict like this.
What about Russia and China?
No, they would be opposed to any war, and they will quietly, to the extent.
What do you think they're doing right now? They're just working diplomatically behind the scenes?
Absolutely, that's exactly what they're doing. The Russians especially. I mean, the Russians will be, you can be quite sure that the phone lines in Moscow are buzzing and whirring with activity, with the Russians calling Tehran and calling Riyadh. Remember, the Russians have good relations with Saudi Arabia as well as with Iran, and have been negotiating with the Saudis, at the Saudis' insistence, on an oil production cut agreement. So the Russians have leverage over Saudi Arabia, and they'll be saying to the Saudis, look, you want an oil production cut agreement from us? If so, we want restraint on the Iran issue, because we don't want to see a war with Iran in the Gulf at this time. It's completely against our interests. And the Russians also have good relations with Israel, and they will be saying the same thing to the Israelis. We do not want to see a war with Iran. At the end of the day, though, if war comes, the Russians can't stop it diplomatically. But what they will do, if such a war happens, is they will make very clear, as will China, that they oppose it, and they will then maneuver themselves to act as mediators to bring the war to a stop as soon as it becomes clear that it isn't going anywhere, which is what I predict will happen. If the war escalates and there is a US frontal attack on Iran, then the Russians and the Chinese will be in a very difficult position. But I think at that point, they would start to back Iran.
I think the entire world would be in a very difficult position if that was to take
Well,
place. I mean,
it would be
this is like you said,
horrendous.
this is not Iraq and this is not Syria.
Exactly. I mean, it would be horrendous. But I mean, the Russians have a route to Iran across the Caspian Sea, which is controlled by the Russian fleet, and they also have routes to Iran through Central Asia, as does China. And I would expect that in the event of an all-out war, that the Russians will be doing what they can to secure their interests in Iran as best they can, and they would certainly be calling out any attack on Iran as aggression.
All right, let's wrap it up with a couple of questions, Alexander, from the live chat. From William, the Duran, what do you think Israel will do when it realizes it is over? The world is hip to them, bioweapons. So the question, well, the comment is really the world is opening their eyes as to many of the provocations that you mentioned Israel has done in the past, and that this could possibly be another provocation via Israel. And you have along the same lines, Alexander, from Richie the Forky at the Duran. Alex, I believe Israel shot torpedoes at those oil tankers. Your thoughts? So, obviously a lot of people's attention is going to not only Saudi Arabia, but to possibly Israel being behind this attack. What do you make of that?
I have to say that is a distinct possibility because Israel has the greater capability. We're talking about a submarine that does, to me, point more likely to Israel than to Saudi Arabia. Israel has a very potent submarine fleet, which Saudi Arabia, frankly, doesn't. So that would indeed be, I mean, Israel must be a possible suspect in this incident. If there is a war between the United States and Iran, and if people accept that Israel is responsible for it, then I think it will turn international opinion against Israel very strongly. And I think people in Israel should understand that, and they should try to restrain their leaders from prosecuting this war. But I'm afraid the atmosphere in Israel has been so poisoned on the question of Iran, and people are so belligerent about it there, that I don't see much sign of restraint coming out. But I agree with our viewers. It would be for Israel, in my opinion, a war too far.
All right, let's take a couple more questions from Charles Kelly. How much will oil go to? And Alexander, on this point, I was reading a tweet via Zero Hedge, and they said Saudi Arabia kills two birds with one stone. I'm paraphrasing it. They said that they get to villainize Iran with this attack, and of course the price of oil goes up. So oil, that is something that we need to discuss here because that plays a very key role in this part of the world. What do you think is going to happen with oil?
Well, who knows? I mean, with oil prices, it's always very difficult to say. If there is a war in Iran with Iran, and if there is an interruption in oil supplies in the Gulf, which there certainly could be, then I think that all bets are off. Oil would the oil price would rise. I think some people have been talking about $250 a barrel, as compared to around $60 a barrel.
You
where
think
it
you can
is
get
now.
over 200?
I think you can get over
if there's
200
a conflict.
if there's a conflict. Now, I'm not saying that will happen,
right,
but I have seen people talk about those sort of numbers, and that would be a massive crisis for the world economy. Of course, it would depend how long the war continued for, and whether a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was effective, and for how long it lasted. But as I understand it, the Strait of Hormuz is very narrow, and it would not actually be very difficult for the Iranians to blockade it, perhaps by sinking some ships there. So, it's a possibility. Now, whether that will happen, I don't know, because we don't know where this situation is going. But I think the Zero Hedge point about Saudi Arabia is a very good one, because certainly the Saudis have been gung-ho about a war with Iran. And MBS is obsessed with Iran. if you read his speeches and his articles, Iran comes up all the time. I mean, he's got Iran on the brain. The other thing is that the Saudis need oil, an oil price of at least $85 a barrel to balance their budget. By comparison, the Russian budget balances at the present rate of exchange at just $40 a barrel. The price of oil at the moment is around $60 a barrel. So already the Saudis, for the Saudis, oil is at too low a price, whereas for the Russians, they are perfectly comfortable with the present price. Russia also has a floating and flexible exchange rate. So if oil prices were to fall to $30 a barrel, which some people have been talking about because there is at present an oversupply of oil, even then Russia could adjust to it quite effortlessly by simply allowing the ruble to fall. Whereas Saudi Arabia has a fixed exchange rate and it can't do that. So from a Saudi point of view, anything that increases the oil price is welcome. Having said that, the right way for the Saudis to increase the oil price is to negotiate an oil production cut with the Russians, which the Russians are open to doing. It is not to start a war with Iran, which could have completely unpredictable and very dangerous consequences. But with people like MBS, I'm afraid, you never can know. I mean, he's not someone, I'm afraid, who makes finely balanced calculations like that.
What about a rising oil price for the U.S., Alexander, and for the Trump White House and the Trump economy?
Yes. I mean, parts of the U.S. economy benefit. I mean, the United States now has a very large oil industry. If you look at which are the three countries which are the leaders in oil production, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia are the three big producers, and they each produce roughly the same amounts of oil. Sometimes it's Russia that produces the most, sometimes it's the US. At the moment, I believe, as it happens, that it is the US. So the US would actually benefit in some ways from a higher oil price. And of course, the oil industry in the US, and especially the shale oil industry in the US, which has been running into increasing difficulties, would also benefit from a higher oil price. But the US is a huge, highly diversified economy, and there are large parts of that economy, many sectors, and many people who, on the contrary, would be adversely affected by a high oil price, and many of those people are Donald Trump's electoral base. So, if you own a car, if you pay for your heating, if you own a manufacturing company, you do not want to see oil prices at $250 a barrel. And if you're Europe, which is not a major oil producer, you absolutely do not want to see oil prices at $250 a barrel, nor do you want that kind of price if you're China, or Japan. So, and these are all countries the United States trades with. Overall, it would be a disaster.
Yeah, Carolyn says that would be very negative for Trump. He's kept the gas prices fairly level.
Yeah.
So, Alexander, let's wrap it up. We've been live now for a good half hour, a little over a half hour. We wanted to get this news to you guys. This is breaking news. This is big news. But hopefully, Alexander, cooler heads will prevail. People will get to the bottom as to what happened. Or if they don't get to the bottom as to what happened, they'll step back from any rising tensions and step back from any kind of conflict. So far, Trump has not come out with a statement. I believe he hasn't said anything about this yet. I don't think Russia has come out with a statement either. How do you think this is going to play out, Alexander? Say tomorrow, 3 days from now, 4 days from now?
Well, as I said, I think that the Russians the reason they're not bringing out any statements is because, as I said, the telephones from Moscow are working overtime with the Russians talking in private to everybody that they can and not wanting to jeopardize these very anxious and difficult negotiations that they're conducting by saying anything in public that might cause offense or might put a spoke in the wheel of those negotiations. And it is a good sign that Donald Trump has held back from saying anything. But I will say something about that, which is that on other occasions when things have happened, like when there have been attacks, alleged chemical weapons attacks in places like Han Sheikhun and Duma, Donald Trump, held off from saying anything for a couple of hours, and that meant that people thought that it would all blow over, and then it didn't.
Excellent. That's my fear. So, excellent point. Sometimes when he's quiet, missiles just launch and then he comes out with a tweet or something. I mean, it's
exactly. So one can't be sure with Trump, and though one would hope that cool heads prevail, one can't be sure. And with people like Netanyahu, MBS, Bolton, and Pompeo on the scene, one certainly can't be sure.
Yeah, I think we have a very tense, I would say the window's 24 hours.
Yes.
Where Trump could, I'm not saying he will, he could react on the advice of a Bolton, Pompeo, or Netanyahu. And it could be something along the lines of what happened in Syria.
Exactly.
I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think the chances are low. I still think the thinking behind this is to build a case over time, and then after the 2020 elections, then I think if Trump wins, then I think something could go down then. But
I agree. Actually, I think at this point in time, Donald Trump will not want anything that could jeopardize his prospects in the 2020 elections. And I think even if Bolton comes along to him and says, well, if we launch a single missile strike on Iran, that will send a warning to Iran, and the situation won't escalate any further. I think Donald Trump understands enough, at least I hope he does, to be able to say no to that, because he will realize that if you start going down that route, then you simply put yourself on an escalator for further escalation. So I'm inclined to agree, but it's going to be an anxious couple of hours.
Yeah, God, even a missile strike like what you just said right now, what you just described right now, would probably send the price of oil in the markets, would just send them off the charts, bonkers.
Absolutely, because the Iranians would certainly threaten to retaliate if more things like that happened. And I don't think the markets think that the Iranians are crying wolf here, because and I'm sure they're not actually.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, thank you for that analysis. Thank you to everyone who joined us for that chat. I believe that it was Kate wanted to get a clearer view of this painting behind me. So let me move the camera for Kate there. There you go, Kate. Mm-hmm. Let me move away from that. All right. Mm-hmm. So that's for Kate. I saw that in the chat. Alexander, any final words?
Any final words?
Yeah.
Well,
maybe on Assange very quickly, if we can just get your take. I think it was Richie that said Assange has, was it the UK the Home Secretary, I believe, signed the extradition?
He signed the extradition warrant. I was on a.
You were a speaker on Assange yesterday, so that's why your quick take on that. I know you're a little pressed for time. But,
I know. I mean, briefly. I mean, I think it's a very ominous sign. I think what has clearly been going on with Assange is that the British and the US are clearly working very closely, it's beginning to look to me as if the British, the Swedes, and the Americans have been in telephone contact with each other and reached an agreement that he's going to be extradited to the US very quickly. I say that because, of course, we've had this second superseding indictment under the Espionage Act just come out within, the last couple of days. The US asked Britain to extradite him to the US only yesterday, and within hours, Sayed Javid, who is our Home Secretary, signed off on it. So I think that it's a sign that the British government has decided that they're going to put all their doubts if they had any doubts, to one side, and they're going to send Assange to the United States. Now, there is still a legal battle to be fought. Assange can still challenge this decision of the Home Secretary before the British courts, and I predict there will be a long battle there. But the history of Julian Assange's battles in the British courts have not been good for him. The judiciary up to now has been systematically hostile. And though I think on the facts he has a very good case, I'm far from confident he will win it.
And where can people find that video where you were speaking yesterday, Alexander? Is it on YouTube or
It
do you
is,
know?
it is on YouTube. It is on YouTube. I can send it to you, and you can provide a link if you like.
Okay.
I was
I'll put a
actually
link in the
main.
description for this live
Yes.
when I fix
Yeah.
it up. Okay, so
Fix it. Yeah.
send me that link and I'll put it up
Link.
there.
Exactly. I mean, I was the first speaker. I mean, I was rushed in, I should say, right at the last moment, and I had to improvise that address. Basically, say it off the top of my head, but you can see how well I did, and I do think I did explain the legal issues pretty well.
All right, and one final question. This is a good one. That's why I want to ask it of you. It's from Saya. It says, what is Boris Johnson's position on Assange? Will he help him?
Well, I don't think he's going to help him. I think Boris Johnson, once he becomes Prime Minister, will want him in Washington also. I don't see Boris Johnson holding out against the United States on this issue.
All right, Alexander. Thank you very much. You have a magic mug on that desk.
I
By any
certainly do.
chance?
I've got two of them, as you can
All
see.
right.
Those who watch our videos can have no doubt been seeing them, but here they are. They're always on my desk now. Well, this one always is. We did a video just before, so I've also got my wife's magic mug also with the coat of arms of Moscow and St. George slaying the dragon of untruth and false news. And as you can see, I'm also wearing my nice polo shirt, which I always
I'm
plan.
also wearing my Duran shirt. That's because Jorg says, Jorg Mayer says, time for Duran mug and shirt promotion. LOL, yeah. Well,
Well, yes, well, why not?
now with
Why
the
not?
mass demonetization and all the stuff that's going on, the Duran shop helps us now more than ever. So we really
Indeed,
appreciate
indeed.
that. All right, let's wrap it up. Thank you to everyone who joined us on this chat. We hope you guys have a really good Thursday evening. And we'll be monitoring this story because I think it is going
Absolutely.
to be a tense 24 hours. Let's see how it shapes up,
Absolutely.
and let's hope for the best.
Absolutely.
All
Absolutely.
right, thank you guys.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Okay, right, bye.